A smile on a corpse, mockery, or message? Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. Tell me where you're watching from. Your comments mean everything. Now the mystery begins. The November fog lay upon Baker Street in long, sallow ribbons, so that the gas lamps were not so much beacons as islands, and the sound of hoof and wheel came dulled, as if the city had been wrapped in flannel. Holmes was at the window, idly thrumming the low strings of his violin with the bow, when Watson came in with the afternoon papers under his arm and the smell of the street on his coat. He had scarce taken off his gloves when Holmes turned his head a fraction. "You found the Strand muddy, then?" said he, "and your cabman chosen more for urgency than prudence. The splash upon your left cuff is from the gutter outside the chemist's where his horse stumbled, and you apologize though he was in the wrong." Watson smiled in spite of himself. "Your charity to cabmen grows with the fog, Holmes. As to the splash, it might have been anywhere, nowhere but there," Holmes returned, nodding towards the cuff. "Granular ochre mixed with coal dust, peculiar to that foul run by Charing Cross. But keep your pardon for a moment. We shall want all our courtesies. We are to have a visitor." He had hardly spoken when there came a brisk tapping on the stair, and the door opened upon a lady in mourning whose veil, thrown back for air, exposed a face striking less for beauty than for the arrested energy in it, as if every feature were braced to meet an unseen blow. Behind her, uncertain whether to enter, hovered a gentleman of the professional middle class, square-jawed, carefully dressed, with the anxious eyes of one accustomed to dealing with the bereaved. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the lady said, "I am Mrs. Isabel Kavanagh of Grosvenor Place. This is the Reverend Oswald Fitch, Vicar of St. Jude's, Dorsington Street. We beg of you a moment that is, I fear, out of all proportion to the hour." Holmes had already indicated the chair nearest the fire. "Pray be seated, madam, and you also, sir. My friend, Dr. Watson, can assure you that my time is the least expensive commodity in London when a case touches upon the abnormal." "Abnormal?" The lady repeated the word with a little shiver. "That is the very thing, Mr. Holmes. I have come about a matter so monstrous that any person of sense would laugh at it, and so intimate that I blush to speak." She twisted her black gloves together, and it was then that I observed upon the kid skin a faint smear, as if from contact with some surface that had been treated with grease or varnish. It was no stain of mourning. Holmes had observed it also. I saw by that quick contraction of his eyelids, which to me was as eloquent as a shout. But his voice was gentle. "Compose yourself, Mrs. Kavanagh. Tell us what has occurred. My husband, Mr. Ambrose Kavanagh, the shipbroker, died suddenly last Tuesday. The inquest yesterday returned natural causes. The coroner said heart failure, brought on by overwork and those cruel east winds. He was—" Her composure faltered for the first time. "He was laid out last night at our house." "The funeral took place at noon today." Holmes inclined his head. "You have suffered a heavy blow, madam." She swallowed. "Yes. Yet it is not the blow of which I must speak. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, at my husband's funeral this afternoon, as we left the church and the bearers set the coffin upon the trestles by the gate, I looked up, only by chance, at the faces of the people gathered beyond the railings. There was a crowd. One always has a crowd. London is morbid. And among them I saw—" She stopped. The fire hissed softly in the grate. The Reverend Fitch made an involuntary movement, as if to interpose. "Mrs. Kavanagh," he said, "perhaps I might—" She shook her head and went on with a steadiness that was more dreadful than her previous agitation. "I saw my husband." He stood not 20 yards away, bareheaded. He never wore a hat easily, and he smiled at me. I should know his smile among 1,000. I caught at Mrs. Harbury's arm and cried out. When I looked again, he was gone. The vicar cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, you must understand that our poor friend had had scarcely more than a mouthful of broth these 3 days. Grief deranges the senses. There is, besides, a singular resemblance, so I am told, between Mr. Kavanagh and a distant kinsman who came up from Sussex for the funeral. In the press and confusion, Mrs. Kavanagh turned upon him with a dignity that silenced him at once. "I know of Mr. Neville Fiske," said she. "He resembles my husband in height and posture, as any two men of the same family might. But he has a scar near the temple from a fall in boyhood." The man at the gate had no scar. He was Ambrose, smiling. "I should have thought myself mad, save for what came before." "What came before?" asked Holmes. She drew from her reticule a small envelope and handed it to him with a hand that shook for all her outward calm. "This was given me by the undertaker's man when they brought my husband from the chamber to the hearse. He said it had lain on the lid under the pall. I did not open it until we were in the carriage." "Read it?" Sir Holmes opened the packet and held up a single card. There were but 6 words upon it, traced in a bold, unformed hand. "Smile for me at noon, A." Holmes sat as if carved from the chair. The violin, which he had laid across the sill, trembled with the draught and sounded a single ghostly note. Then he laid the card upon the mantel-shelf and leaned forward, his fingertips together. "This was found upon the coffin lid, you say?" "Yes." "And the initial? Might it be your husband's?" "It is his way to sign only A on messages to me, but he never wrote so coarsely. His hand is neat and small." The vicar stirred again. "The bearers swear there was no card when they fixed the lid," he put in. "And the coroner's seal." "The coroner's seals were broken this morning," said Mrs. Kavanagh in a low voice. "Mr. Archer, the undertaker, came at 7 to make—" She faltered. "To make certain adjustments. He told me that in cases of sudden death, the features may be—" He took with him a file and a little jar. "When I saw my husband at 9, his mouth, which had been slack, was arranged. It looked almost as if he smiled. I reproached myself for thinking it." The card lay upon the lid at 11:30. When the pall was lifted at the hall door, Holmes rose and walked to the window where the fog pressed its grey face against the glass like a curious urchin. "Pray tell me, Mrs. Kavanagh," said he, without turning, "did your husband ever wear a moustache?" "Never," she answered, surprised. "He was smooth-shaven always." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "someone this morning had with him a file and a little jar." He came back to the fire and stood with his long, delicate hands behind him. "You have done wisely to come to me at once. There are 2 courses: to treat this as a hallucination, with a cruel note from some vulgar hand, or to treat it as a message and a sign. I confess the case touches on the abnormal in 6 ways. Tell me, what was Mr. Kavanagh's business beyond shipbroker? I have a recollection of the name from the shipping reports. He dealt in consignments from the Levant, dried fruit, occasionally copper ingots from Smyrna. Of late there has been a question of a very large policy upon his life, £50,000 for the sake of our boy at school. The papers are with Mr. Jabez Harbury, his partner." Holmes's glance shot past her to the Reverend, and then to me. I knew that look. The scent was up. "Lestrade," I suggested. "In due season," Holmes answered. "First, Mrs. Kavanagh, if you will permit, I must ask you 2 or 3 questions which may appear idle. When Mr. Archer took charge this morning, who besides yourself was in the room?" "Mr. Archer, his assistant, a blond young man with a hare lip, Mrs. Harbury, and my maid Eliza. The vicar called later to pray with me." "The assistant," said Holmes, hare lip. "Blonde? Good. Did either man smoke?" Mrs. Kavanagh looked bewildered. "Mr. Archer smelled of something sharp. Spirits, perhaps. The younger man had a cigarette behind his ear when he came up." Mr. Archer reproved him. Holmes nodded as if he had expected no other answer. He went to the mantel and sniffed the mourning card, then the gloves, which lay upon Mrs. Kavanagh's lap. "You have handled the lid?" "Yes, when I kissed it at the door." "Then your glove has taken a trace of what was upon it," Holmes said quietly. "A thin beeswax. Undertakers use it to smooth the features and to affix certain, appliances. There is also a whiff of spirit gum." Your undertaker is a man of expedients." He looked again at the card. "And this was written with a thick common pencil. Note the fat granular line, and not on your husband's ordinary notepaper." "I know every paper in the house," she said. "This is none of them." Holmes's eyes grew distant. "Who among the mourners carried a bouquet?" "Only Mr. Neville Fiske," she replied, after a moment's thought. "A small thing, white chrysanthemums. He laid them by the rail while he assisted Mrs. Harbury into the coach." "Chrysanthemums," said Holmes, and there was in his voice that tone which I had learned to distrust, a tone of almost playful abstraction which with him meant the deduction had already begun to form, precise and merciless. "And Mr. Archer? Where is his establishment?" "In Dorsington Street, a few doors from St. Jude's." "Excellent," said Holmes. "You will return home, Mrs. Kavanagh, and suffer no one to come near the coffin until you hear from me. Lock the door if you can. Admit only your maid, and let her be with you. Reverend Fitch, be so good as to hold yourself at my disposal for an hour. Watson, your hat." Mrs. Kavanagh rose, searching his face with a look that I could not read, in which anger and hope contended. "Mr. Holmes," she said very quietly, "you believe me?" "I believe what you saw," Holmes returned. "Whether you saw the living man or the image of him, and who caused you to see it, is precisely what we are about to discover." She made him a little curtsy and was gone, with the vicar in her wake. Holmes waited, listening to the retreating steps. Then he took the mourning card in the fold of his handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. "You saw, Watson?" he said. "I saw a brave woman tormented by an anonymous scoundrel," I cried. "And I saw, by heaven, Holmes, the very air of the thing is monstrous, to smile at one's own funeral." Holmes took up his cane. "There are smiles and smiles," said he. "Come, we will first call upon Mr. Archer, of Dorsington Street. I have a prejudice against undertakers who smell of spirit gum. Afterwards, if luck is with us, we shall take the long way by the mews behind Grosvenor Place and learn why a gentleman in mourning would choose chrysanthemums in November when all the town is full of lilies. I should value, too, a glance at the left-hand trestle at St. Jude's gate. There was coal dust upon Mrs. Kavanagh's glove that came thence, and granules of something else, sawdust perhaps, not of the sort used in a church, but of a carpenter's yard. When a man smiles at his funeral, Watson, it is the living who have moved the lips." And with that characteristic blend of irony and purpose which was his mark at the threshold of a case, he rapped the bow upon the violin strings. One bright note, like a spark, struck in. The fog snatched his Inverness from the peg, and we went down together into the waiting London dusk. We found Dorsington Street crouched like a thin-lipped mourner within earshot of St. Jude's bell, a channel of shuttered windows and narrow shop-fronts where the black paint of tradesmen's boards had drunk the light. Archer's establishment presented the usual emblematic display, a discreet hatchment, a draped panel, together with that odour of disinfectant and withered flowers which clings about such premises like a second sign. A small boy in a black apron was scattering sawdust across the flags. Holmes stooped, pinched a few grains between finger and thumb, and smelt them as though they had been snuff. The boy stared, open-mouthed. Holmes's forefinger traced a neat crescent in the dust. "Pine, fresh cut, not church sweepings," he murmured to me, then aloud, "Your master within?" The inner door admitted us to a dim parlour where an elderly man rose with professional gravity. He was of the spare, sallow sort bred by indoor trades. His hair was iron-grey and brushed forward, and his hands, when they motioned us to sit, were incongruously small, the nails rimmed with that blueness which comes of long handling of cold water and spirits. On the mantel-shelf stood a row of little jars like a physician's armamentarium. One was labelled, in a clerkly hand, wax, B, and another gum mastic. "Mr. Archer," said Holmes pleasantly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, we come at the instance of Mrs. Kavanagh of Grosvenor Place." A faint professional sorrow composed the undertaker's features. A deplorable bereavement, sir. Everything that skill and care could accomplish. Precisely, Holmes interposed, glancing once at the jars. It is your skill that interests me. You were so good, I understand, as to visit the house at 7 this morning and make certain adjustments. Archer inclined his head. In the interests of decency and consolation to the survivors, sir? Sudden failure of the heart is apt to leave the facial muscles relaxed, a little stiffening, purely mechanical. His gaze slid towards the jars and back again. For which you employ beeswax and mastic, said Holmes. I neither praise nor censure, I merely note. Your assistant is a fair young man with a hare-lip. Pike, sir? Reuben Pike. A sober lad, though I admonished him to leave off carrying his cigarette about. He fetched the trestles to St. Jude's before 11. So early, said Holmes. Why so early if the funeral was at noon? The verger is particular about arrangements, Archer returned, with a hint of asperity that belied his mournful mask. There was a second funeral to follow. We thought it better to be forward. Holmes drifted to the mantel-shelf where he bent, not at the labelled jars, but at a little tray into which had been tossed a florist's wire, twisted at the end into a loop, and a scrap of coarse pencil shaved to a chisel edge. He took up the wire, weighed it on his palm like a coin, and replaced it. You are acquainted with the Harburys, I think? Mr. Harbury is a principal in the firm employing the deceased, Archer replied. He called here last night about the order for the hearse horses. Mrs. Harbury, she came to comfort the widow at the house this morning. And Mr. Neville Fisk. I know the name, sir. I cannot say I know the face. You will be happy to hear, said Holmes with one of his sudden, airy transitions, that I do not propose to put you to the trouble of a sworn statement, but I must beg the favour of a look at your workroom. Archer hesitated so faintly that another eye than mine might have missed it. Then, with a resigned gesture, he conducted us through a narrow passage that smelt of wood shavings and cheap varnish. The workroom was small and scrupulously swept. A bench stood under the window where a plane lay with curls of fresh pine still clinging to its mouth. Near it, a carpenter's pencil, worn blunt at one end, had traced a dark smudge upon the wood. On a shelf were folded strips of black crepe. Below, a stone jar exhaled a ghost of spirituous perfume. In one corner, a portable trestle leaned against the wall, its top rail showing a recently rubbed patch that glittered faintly. Holmes's finger touched the glitter. Beeswax, he said. You affix the pull rings with it? On occasion, sir. The old rings do not always sit easy, undoubtedly. He went down upon one knee and examined the bench with an absorbed eye. A small nick in the surface had caught some pallid dust of a different texture from the pine, powdery, with a yellowish cast. He lifted it to his nostrils and gave me the ghost of a smile. Pollen, he whispered. Chrysanthemum. Archer, to do him justice, betrayed no more than a professional perplexity. There's many a wreath through here, sir. We lay them by the window till they're called for just so, said Holmes. One last point. When Mrs. Kavanagh left her husband's chamber for the hall door, who lifted the pall? Pike and I together, sir. And when you returned for the pall after the departure? The verger removed it at St. Jude's. We fetched it back on our return Holmes's manner, which had been velvet from our entrance, took on, as we said our courteous adieus, a certain crispness, like steel under the velvet. In the street once more, he walked with that swift, noiseless stride which boded a harvest of facts. There is an economy in vice, as in virtue, Watson, said he, as we turned the corner, and the square tower of St. Jude's loomed above the roofs. Men seldom invent two devices when one will serve. Our ingenious friend of the card also handled a bouquet this morning. The florist's wire and the chrysanthemum dust have betrayed him. The trestles were early, at the church. Someone desired time, privacy, and a stable surface on which to write with a chisel pencil. The cheapest desk in London is a plank set up on a pair of trestles. The churchyard gate showed the black scars of innumerable funerals. The trestles had been set inside, under the Gothic arch where the damp had filmed the stone. Holmes's eye went straight to the left-hand trestle, where, that morning, the coffin had briefly rested, and along its upper member to the inner edge of the plank. There, upon the dulled wood, a faint streak of graphite ran and ended in the blunt beginning of a letter. He bent close, shading the place with his hands from the weak light. "S," he said softly. "Or the beginning of an S." "A rehearsal?" I suggested. "A trial of pressure," he returned. "Note the grain torn here. The pencil was dull, and the writer, impatient, bore upon it. The pall would hide him. The card itself, coarse stock, will take such a stroke better than the polished wood. Do you see this too?" With his penknife he lifted a pinhead of something translucent from the iron ring that had held the pall at the corner. He touched it with his tongue, made a face of disgust, and held his finger towards me. There was the unmistakable sweetness of beeswax. "In other words," I said, "the card could have been tacked by a dab of wax to the lid under the pall, and would shift but little when the mourners touched the coffin." "Just so." "And it would be easily removed at the hearse," said Holmes. He glanced up and down the road. A coster's barrow rattled past. A policeman lingered at the opposite corner, in talk with a nursemaid. The fog had thinned to a gauze in which faces floated like medallions. "We are observed," he added, in that indifferent tone which with him meant the opposite. "Come, the mews." The mews lay like a private intestine behind the square. Stable doors, a farrier's forge, the sweet, sour smell of dung and hot iron. Holmes's long hand beckoned a shock-headed boy who had been currying a horse with more zeal than method. "A tanner for your truth," said he, holding out a coin. "At noon today, when the black coach came to St. Jude's Gate, did any gentleman pass this way, the back of the railings here, without a hat?" The boy's eyes widened. "He did, sir. I never see a gent so bold bareheaded. He come along quick-like, and when the bell tolled, he laughed. Leastways he smiled, as if it tickled him. Then he slipped into Mr. Dorn's cooperage. I was going to fetch him out, thinking it a shame on a burying, but the coopery banged his door." "What of the gentleman's face?" Holmes asked. "Any mark?" The boy frowned. "Smooth as a plate, sir, but shiny like—" He groped. "Like our groom when he shaves of a Sunday and rubs summin on after." Holmes's nostrils dilated. "Did he carry anything?" "A bit of paper in his fingers, white as my shirt." He folded it and put it away, then nips off. "Left nothing but the stink of varnish, Holmes repeated thoughtfully, and slipped the coin into the boy's hand. "Mr. Dorn?" We found the cooper in his gloom, hoops stacked like vertebrae behind him. He was a square man with a beard and an honest reluctance to be mixed in the dramas of his betters. Yes, he had closed his door for the sake of peace when the crowd swelled. No gentleman had come into his shop. He had heard a laugh, but London laughs, he remarked, at the funeral as at the fair. Only when Holmes's dry little questions had sifted out all he knew did he volunteer a reminiscence. "There was a florist's lad putting down a bouquet yonder this morning while he tightened his bootlace," he said, jerking his head towards the railings. "Great, ugly white bloom. How do you say 'em?" "Chrysanthemums," said Holmes. "And did the florist's lad speak with anyone?" "Spoke with nobody, but a young gent, tall, dark. He asked him where he bought 'em. Lad said, Rothwell's in Dorsington Street." We left the cooper to his hoops and turned the corner into Dorsington Street again, where, among those doleful trades, a little shop offered wreaths and crosses behind its clouded glass. The air within was heavy with damp stems and bruised petals. A girl in a green baize apron looked up timidly. "Rothwell supplies St. Jude's?" Holmes asked, smiling that engaging smile of his which makes children and shopgirls his allies. "You sent a bouquet of chrysanthemums this morning, a small sheaf, for Mr. Neville Fiske?" The girl brightened. "Yes, sir." "White chrysanthemums, hard to come by nice this time of year." Mr. Rothwell had some come in from a market gardener at Finchley. We tied 'em with black. Who ordered them? The girl consulted a slate. A lady's maid come last night, sir. Ordered 'em to be paid on delivery at Grosvenor Place. Said to put in no card from us, as the master was particular. Holmes's eye, which had idled about the little counter, came to rest upon a sheaf of tiny blank cards thrust in a tumbler, each with a florist's wire looped through. He lifted one card by its wire, coarse stock, the very twin of Mrs. Kavanagh's morning message. He slipped it back without a word. "And Mr. Rothwell?" he added carelessly. "Is he here?" "Out, sir. Deliveries," the girl said. "But here's the book." Holmes ran a finger down the page, pausing at the entry we sought. "Paid at door by Mr. Fisk." His nostrils gave that little flare which means to me that the scent has strengthened. "Thank you, child. You have saved us much time." When we had gained the street again, I could no longer keep silence. "Holmes," I cried, "for heaven's sake, what is in your mind? You have the wire, the pollen, the wax. You have an apparition in the crowd and a card that pretends to be from a dead man. But who profits by torturing a widow with such devilry?" "The man who needs the widow at a certain pitch of belief in order to secure a certain signature," Holmes answered coolly. "Or the man who desires to test whether his illusion will bear the light of noon before he attempts a larger deception. Observe how all this theatre hinges upon noon, the bell, the gate, the crush. It is a stage. The smiling man is the actor. The undertaker provides the properties, the florist the clue. And the author of the note signs himself A, I said. Ambrose? Archer? Or any fool would have used A, Holmes returned, with a thin smile. We shall not dignify him yet with a name. There is a mind here, Watson, but no genius. He borrows other men's tools. Meanwhile, I should be grateful for 15 minutes with Mrs. Kavanagh's maid. A lady's maid who orders flowers at night learns things without being taught. We took the long way by the back of the square, where the fog had sagged into pockets, and the lamps wavered like will-o'-the-wisps in a marsh. Holmes walked swiftly, his head a little forward, as if he smelt the very thread we followed unrolling before him in the air. At the corner he paused to send a messenger, a ragged imp who seemed to blossom out of the brickwork at the whistle's note, with a pencilled line to Wiggins. "Set 2 men on Reuben Pike," he wrote, speaking the words as his pencil scratched. "Another to shadow Neville Fisk if he leaves Grosvenor Place. Report at Baker Street at 7. You are netting them all," said I. "I am netting possibilities," he replied. "The fish will declare himself." For the present, Grosvenor Place. I would know whether Mrs. Harbury is of the sort that strokes a widow's hand or guides it. He looked at me sidelong. And if I may, I should like also to see Ambrose Kavanagh's dressing case. His dressing case? His pomades, Watson, said Holmes, his barber's receipts, his razors. A man who is smooth-shaven always is a man whose face, when altered, is a mask to those who love him. Our smiling friend counted upon that. Let us see how well he counted. The lamps of Grosvenor Place burned dim in the mist, throwing a jaundiced light upon the railings and the hurrying silhouettes of gentlemen bound for their clubs. As we approached the tall house of the Kavanaghs, Holmes drew his shoulders in, quickened his step, and bade me say nothing until he had observed the lay of the land. A black-plumed carriage had just drawn away from the door, leaving 2 servants exchanging whispers at the area gate. Holmes gave them no heed. His attention was fixed upon the upper windows, where a faint glow burned behind the drawn blinds of the morning chamber. Inside, Mrs. Kavanagh received us with that calm which is more terrible than tears. Her veil was still lifted, but her face bore the strained look of one who has been pressed with condolences until the meaning of words has become ash. She ushered us into a small withdrawing room, and there Holmes, with the deftness of long practice, turned the conversation from her grief to the practical details of the household. "It is your maid Eliza I should most wish to see," he remarked gently. You will forgive me, madam, if I say that ladies' maids have a peculiar genius for knowing what passes in a house. They learn without appearing to listen, and they remember without seeming to notice. Mrs. Kavanagh summoned the girl, who entered presently, a dark, watchful creature with neat cap and apron. Holmes greeted her as though she were the equal of duchesses, a trick of his which never failed to set servants at ease. "You are Eliza? Then you ordered flowers last night at Rothwell's?" Her eyes flickered. "Yes, sir." Mrs. Harbury said there should be something suitable from the family side, as Mr. Fiske hadn't thought of it. She gave me the money. Describe the errand to me, if you please, exactly as it occurred. Eliza recounted how Mrs. Harbury, in tones of authority, had bade her step out with the order. The shop was quiet. The girl at the counter had written the slate entry. When Eliza returned, Mrs. Harbury had taken the receipt and told her to mention nothing of it to her mistress, for the poor lady had grief enough. Holmes listened, with eyelids lowered, tapping his long fingers together. "And your mistress knew nothing of these flowers until the moment they were brought to the house?" "Nothing, sir." Holmes leaned forward suddenly, his gaze keen as a knife. "Tell me, Eliza, when Mr. Archer and his assistant raised the coffin this morning, who else was in the chamber?" "Mrs. Harbury stood by the head, sir. She was speaking low to my mistress. I was near the foot." Mr. Archer lifted the pall, and young Mr. Pike stooped to catch the far ring. "Did either of the gentlemen place anything upon the coffin while the pall was raised?" Eliza shook her head. "Not that I saw, sir." "But Mr. Pike—" He dropped his cigarette, he keeps it behind his ear, and stooped quick to snatch it. When he rose, I thought his hand lingered a moment near the lid. I didn't mark it, not till now. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Admirable, Eliza. You have the true observer's gift. One more question. Your late master, Mr. Kavanagh, did he possess any pomades, lotions, or the like for his toilette?" The girl hesitated. "Only a little pot of French cream for the skin, sir." "But he hadn't used it these many weeks." Holmes nodded, rose, and addressed Mrs. Kavanagh with courtesy. "Madam, may I have a glimpse into your husband's dressing-case?" She led us herself to the chamber above. The air was heavy with camphor and flowers. Upon the dressing-table stood razors, neatly stropped, brushes whose ivory handles bore the initials A.C., a small jar of the French cream, still, half full, and a bottle of bay rum, scarcely touched. Holmes examined each item with his delicate precision, holding the jar against the lamp. "This has not been opened for some weeks," said he, brushing dust from the rim. "Yet this morning a witness speaks of a gentleman whose cheeks shone as if newly treated. We shall not need to look far for our masker." He turned, his gaze fixed upon Mrs. Kavanagh. "Madam, forgive my intrusion, but I beg you, until I give word, do not allow even your kind friends, the Harburys, to enter this chamber alone. A stage is prepared, and some have been too ready to play their parts upon it." She pressed her hands together. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe Ambrose lives?" Holmes was silent a moment, then spoke with grave precision. "I believe, madam, that someone desires you to believe it. Whether the desire cloaks a fraud or something darker, we shall soon discover." When we returned to the hall, Holmes lingered by the staircase listening. A low murmur of women's voices floated from the parlour, followed by the rustle of silk. Mrs. Harbury herself appeared, stately and composed, her eyes quick to measure Holmes. "You find, I trust, that all is in order?" she asked. Holmes bowed. "Perfectly in order, for a house in mourning." "You have been a true support to your friend." Her lips curved. "In grief one must lean upon the practical. Isabel is imaginative." "A rare gift," said Holmes softly. "One that perceives truths others overlook." The lady's glance sharpened, but Holmes had already turned to the door. Once in the street, he walked some yards in silence, his head bent. Then he spoke with that dry fervour which I knew well. "Watson, the case quickens. We have a card written with a florist's pencil, a bouquet ordered by stealth, an undertaker's assistant whose hand strays at the coffin lid, and a supposed apparition whose cheeks shine with pomade. Add to this a partner who holds insurance papers of great value, and a kinsman eager to claim resemblance. The stage grows crowded. And Mrs. Harbury? I asked. She is either dupe or accomplice, Holmes replied. But note her insistence that imagination is delusion. A most curious defense when the imagination perceives what she would prefer unseen. No, Watson, we must sift carefully. Tonight, Wiggins will bring me word of Pike and of Neville Fisk. Tomorrow we shall test the strength of these threads. The fog thickened as we made for Baker Street. Holmes strode swiftly, his coat flaring behind him, as if the very vapour of London carried some secret into his keen nostrils. When at last we reached the familiar rooms, he flung himself into his armchair, the firelight striking his aquiline profile. From his pocket he drew the mourning card, set it beside the florist's blank he had obtained, and compared the grain. They were identical. "See, Watson," said he, "our masker has borrowed florist's stock. He has written his false message at a trestle borrowed from undertakers, and adorned it with flowers paid for in another's name. He relies upon borrowed tools, as I told you, but in such borrowings lie the very marks of the thief." He rang for Mrs. Hudson, who presently ushered in one of the Baker Street irregulars, muddy, breathless, and triumphant. The boy handed Holmes a scrap of paper. Holmes read it, and his eyes gleamed. "Excellent." Pike visited Archer's shop at 6:30, lingered in Dorsington Street till 8, then went west to Soho, where he conferred with a man described as tall, dark, and smooth-shaven. They parted at 9. The tale lost the tall man in the alleys near Drury Lane. "Fisk?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head. "The description fits, but I will not name him yet. For now we hold the wire, the wax, the pollen, the pomade. All speak of a hand arranging, smoothing, polishing, a hand that would make the dead smile." He leaned back, fingertips steepled, the firelight playing in his eyes. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall visit Mr. Jabez Harbury at his counting-house. Where there is £50,000, there is motive enough to make the grave give back its dead, if only in a smile." The next morning broke raw and cheerless, with a wind that whipped the fog into tatters and drove it down the river like grey battalions in retreat. Holmes, however, seemed impervious to the weather. He was already dressed in his grey suit and carrying his stick when I came down to breakfast, his eyes alight with that peculiar energy which I had come to recognize as the signal of advancing discovery. He ate little, preferring instead to pace the room, occasionally pausing at the window to glance into the street below, as though measuring the pulse of the city itself. "We go to the counting-house of Jabez Harbury," he announced, when at last he had consented to sit. "I have a particular interest in gentlemen who hold the papers of large life insurance policies. Money is a motive older than Cain, Watson, and it makes men bold enough to write invitations to the dead. We found Harbury and Kavanagh in a narrow street off Fenchurch, wedged between warehouses whose windows were choked with dust and smoke. The brass plate, newly polished, bore both names, yet Holmes pointed out with that sardonic precision of his that the letters of Harbury were fresher cut and deeper than those of Kavanagh. "A firm may be equal in name, Watson," he murmured, "but in reality there is always one who strikes the harder bargain." Inside, the air was redolent of ink, sea salt, and the faint metallic tang of copper ingots. Clerks bent over tall desks, scratching in ledgers, and at the far end of the room a glass office contained a broad man with a florid face and iron-grey whiskers who rose heavily at our approach. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson, you're welcome. This is a house of business, gentlemen, but I understand you come at the request of poor Mrs. Kavanagh. Pray be seated." Holmes inclined his head. "We will not trespass long upon your time, Mr. Harbury. We wish only to acquaint ourselves with the financial standing of the late Mr. Kavanagh. It is rumoured that he had a policy upon his life." Harbury's hand fell to the desk as though to anchor himself. True enough. A policy of £50,000 arranged last spring with myself as trustee for the benefit of his widow and boy. I pressed him to it. Ambrose was never cautious with money, and I thought it my duty. You pressed him to it? Holmes repeated softly. A most benevolent partner. And since his death you, of course, hold the documents. They are here, Harbury replied, indicating a locked drawer. Everything is in order. I have already informed the company Holmes's gaze lingered upon the key in Harbury's waistcoat pocket. In cases of sudden death, companies are seldom eager to pay without close inquiry. The verdict of heart failure may not suffice. You would stand to lose if suspicion fell upon the death. Harbury's florid colour deepened. Sir, do you insinuate? Holmes raised a hand. Not at all. I insinuate nothing. I merely remark that money, like fog, creeps into every crevice of a case. The man's heavy fists clenched upon the desk, but Holmes, unperturbed, had already turned his attention to a chart pinned upon the wall, showing lines of shipping from the Levant. Kavanagh dealt in consignments from Smyrna, I see. Copper, dried fruits, sundries. Were there disputes of late? Harbury shifted uneasily. There was a question of a shipment delayed, some ingots lost at sea. He fretted, poor fellow, but I told him such things happen. He had enemies in business, no more than most men. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Enemies? A Greek broker in Piraeus and a rival house here, Kellner and Blythe. But nothing of consequence. Holmes bowed, signalling the close of the interview. We are obliged to you, Mr. Harbury. It is always instructive to see the ledger side of death outside. He drew me into a narrow alley and leaned upon his stick. Note, Watson, Harbury admits pressing his partner to take the policy, holds the papers, and has already notified the company. He speaks of enemies, but too vaguely. His manner is defensive, not sorrowful. I smell account books, not grief. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when Wiggins himself appeared, bringing fresh reports. Pike, the undertaker's assistant, had been traced again to Soho, where he met the same tall, dark figure before vanishing into a lodging-house off Drury Lane. Fisk, meanwhile, had spent the evening in his club, but the boy noted that he left twice to post letters. Holmes took down the addresses, his eyes glinting. One to Finchley, where chrysanthemums were grown. The other to a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn. I must see both by afternoon. Holmes had drawn me to the solicitor's office, a cold chamber smelling of parchment. The clerk informed us, after much parley, that Mr. Neville Fisk had made inquiries concerning the estate of his cousin Ambrose Kavanagh. Only preliminary inquiries, sir, the clerk said, but very earnest. He desired to know whether a man could claim if the will had not been altered. Did he seem pressed for time? Holmes asked. The clerk hesitated. Indeed, he said, matters might be settled sooner than expected. We emerged into the dim street, and I could restrain myself no longer. Holmes, it is clear enough. Fisk profits by Ambrose's death, presses his claim, and even dares to appear at the funeral, smiling. Holmes shook his head. Too clear, my dear Watson. Too plain. No guilty man would risk so theatrical a display unless he were a fool, and Fisk, for all his pretensions, is not quite a fool. No, the smiling figure may be intended to direct us toward him. Misdirection, Watson, is the stage conjurer's first trick, and this case reeks of theatre. Evening found us once more in Grosvenor Place, at Mrs. Kavanagh's request. She had discovered in her late husband's escritoire a sealed envelope addressed to her, bearing yesterday's date. The handwriting was Ambrose's own. With trembling fingers she gave it to Holmes. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and read aloud, "My dearest Isabel, trust no one. They have contrived my disappearance. Believe nothing that is shown to you. Smile, if you can, at my funeral, as I shall smile at you." The paper slipped from his hand. The silence that followed was broken only by the rustle of Mrs. Kavanagh's dress as she sank into her chair. Holmes stooped and recovered the sheet, holding it to the lamp. "Observe, Watson, the ink is still tacky at the folds. This letter was written within the last 12 hours. Ambrose Kavanagh, declared dead a week ago, has written to his wife. But Holmes, that is impossible. He smiled faintly. Nothing is impossible, only improbable. Either we deal with a forgery of rare skill, or Ambrose yet lives. Both are extraordinary. But one is true. He slipped the letter into his pocketbook. The play advances, Watson. Our smiling man may be more than a ghost. Tomorrow we must seek the truth at its darkest corner. I have reason to believe that coffin at St. Jude's may not have held the man it proclaimed. He turned to Mrs. Kavanagh, his voice gentle but firm. Madam, I beg you, whatever happens, confide in no one, not even those who call themselves your truest friends. This house is beset by actors, each playing a part, and only by silence may you guard yourself. Her pale face lifted toward him with something like hope. Then you think he lives? Holmes's eyes shone with a curious light. I think, madam, that we are upon the edge of revelation. And if Ambrose Kavanagh does live, we shall find him, whether smiling or not. We left her thus, with the candlelight wavering about her drawn features. In the cab, Holmes sat rigid, his long fingers drumming upon his knee. At last he spoke, more to himself than to me. Beeswax, spirit gum, florist's wire, borrowed cards, borrowed trestles, and now a letter written by the dead. The hand that directs this drama has a cruel wit, Watson, but it will overplay itself. Tomorrow we test the coffin. The following day dawned with a cutting wind that swept the river mist into hard ridges against the shop fronts and left the air brittle with frost. Holmes was uncommonly silent at breakfast, his mind turned inward. He studied the letter recovered from Mrs. Kavanagh again and again, examining its folds, its ink, even the very fibres of the paper, as if each might yield a secret. When at last he spoke, it was in the flat tone I had learned to fear, for it meant that he saw some horror where others glimpsed only mystery. Watson, we must visit St. Jude's without delay. If the dead man has written a letter dated yesterday, then the coffin we saw borne to the grave cannot have carried what it claimed. There is but one means of certainty. We were fortunate in the Reverend Mr. Fitch, who, despite his earlier reluctance to countenance the widow's vision, proved more pliable when confronted with Holmes's quiet authority. That afternoon, under the pretense of verifying certain burial records, we gained admittance to the vestry. The church was chill and deserted, the pale light of November filtering through the lancet windows. Holmes wasted no time in examining the undertaker's register, tracing each entry with his long finger. Here, Kavanagh, Ambrose, buried yesterday, Vault 17. Mr. Fitch, I must beg an unusual indulgence. You will forgive my bluntness, but the truth demands that we see the coffin. The vicar's eyes widened. Exhumation? Impossible, sir. Against every law. Not exhumation, Holmes interposed. The vault is but newly sealed. A glance will suffice. If the authorities must be summoned, better that we summon them than an insurance agent with suspicions of fraud. Reluctantly, the clergyman led us down into the crypt. The air was close, heavy with stone damp and the faint, acrid note of pitch. In a corner niche stood the coffin, already secured within its brick recess, the mortar upon the ceiling slab scarcely hardened. Holmes's eyes glittered as he drew from his pocket a thin steel probe. With your leave, Mr. Fitch? And before the horrified vicar could object, Holmes had scraped back enough mortar to shift the slab and reveal the coffin within. It was a handsome thing of polished oak, its brass nameplate gleaming in the lantern's glow. Holmes bent low, pressing his ear against the seam. "Note, Watson," he whispered, "no scent of decay. For a man said to have died over a week ago, the absence is instructive." At his request, the verger prized back the lid with trembling hands. My own heart hammered, for though accustomed to Holmes's ghastly pursuits, there was something profoundly dreadful in that moment. The lid creaked open, and we all craned forward. The coffin was empty. For a long instant there was no sound but the drip of water somewhere in the crypt. Even the vicar was struck dumb. Holmes straightened slowly, his features drawn and white. "So, the smiling man was no apparition, Watson. Ambrose Kavanagh yet walks this earth. But why, Holmes?" I stammered. "Why this monstrous play, the funeral, the widow's torment, the letter?" "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we are to learn." Holmes replaced the slab with brisk efficiency and pressed the vicar to silence. "Say nothing. The fewer who know, the better. A corpse that is not in its coffin is bait for many a wolf, and we must see who hungers." Once outside in the raw air, Holmes quickened his pace, his thoughts racing ahead of his feet. "Consider it, Watson. We have a man who vanishes from his house, a coffin borne empty to the grave, a letter penned days after his supposed death. Either he is the architect of this deception or its victim. If the former, he is playing a bold game indeed, perhaps to escape debts or enemies. If the latter, then he has been spirited away, and others make use of his name for their own ends." "Harbury?" I ventured. Holmes nodded curtly. "Harbury profits by control of the policy. Fisk, too, profits if his cousin is gone. And somewhere in the shadows lurks a hand, skilled enough to stage a drama fit for the theatre. Undertaker, florist, forged letters. I would know whose pens scratched that card and whose pomade glistened on the cheeks of the smiling phantom." That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes sent further instructions to Wiggins, setting his army of ragged spies upon Archer's assistant, upon the florist's shop, upon Fisk himself. He dispatched me, meanwhile, to call discreetly upon a physician known to the coroner, to confirm whether any true examination of Kavanagh's body had ever taken place. The answer was illuminating in the extreme. The coroner, satisfied by Archer's report of heart failure and by Harbury's insistence upon haste, had foregone a full post-mortem. Holmes received the news with a sharp exclamation. "Then we stand on the brink of revelation. The man may never have died at all. A sham death, an empty coffin, a widow bewildered. Watson, the pieces move into place." We had scarcely finished our supper when there came a rap upon the door, and Wiggins himself bounded in, breathless with excitement. "Mr. Holmes, sir, news. Pike, the undertaker's lad, he met with Mr. Neville Fisk not an hour past, in a tavern by Drury Lane. They was thick as thieves. Fisk gave him money, silver, I swear it, and Pike passed him a note. I near saw it myself, but they was sly." Holmes sprang to his feet, his eyes blazing. "So, Fisk, the kinsman, in league with the undertaker's assistant. That is the alliance behind this masquerade. But for what end? Shall we have them arrested?" I asked. "Not yet," said Holmes, pacing like a caged panther. "An arrest now yields but smoke. We must know whether Ambrose Kavanagh is free, captive, or complicit. Until we lay hands upon the man himself, all else is conjecture." He halted, staring into the fire. "Fisk seeks the estate, Harbury the policy, Pike and Archer provide the trappings. But who forged the letter to the widow? That, Watson, is the signature on this grim performance, and until I hold that penman by the collar, I will not rest." He turned suddenly, his face alight with resolve. "Tomorrow we lay the snare. Pike is the weakest link. A young man with a hare-lip and a loose conscience cannot long withstand temptation. I shall contrive a circumstance in which he must choose between silence and exposure. And when he speaks, the curtain will rise upon the true author of this smiling ghost." With that he settled into his chair, his violin across his knees, and began to pluck at the strings, the harsh notes weaving through the crackle of the fire. I knew the signs well. The storm within him had reached its height, and soon it would break. The case of the man who smiled at his funeral was rushing toward its climax, and I, though but an observer, felt the chill of that smile creep through me as I prepared myself for the morrow's revelations. The following morning, Holmes roused me before the light had properly filtered through the fog, his manner brisk and his mind evidently fixed on some private calculation. He dispatched me to breakfast with barely a word, then spent the better part of an hour at his writing desk, filling sheet after sheet in his swift, angular hand. When at last he rose, he gathered the notes into his pocket, and announced that the trap was ready to be set. "Our weak point is Pike," he said, drawing on his coat. "He is young, venal, and clumsy in his conspiracies. I intend to press upon that fissure until it opens into a chasm. We shall meet him on his own ground." I followed him through the grey streets until we reached Drury Lane, where the theatres slumbered in daylight, and the taverns, though shuttered, gave out the stale scent of beer and tobacco. Holmes made straight for one such house of doubtful repute, pushed open the side door, and, with no hesitation, descended into a low cellar where a few idlers lounged among the barrels. At a corner table, his hair-lip stark in the light of a single oil lamp, sat Reuben Pike. He looked up, startled, and half rose, but Holmes's hand was already upon his shoulder, pressing him back into his seat. "Good morning, Mr. Pike." "No need to move. We are here as friends. This is Dr. Watson. I trust you recall him from the Kavanagh funeral." Pike stammered something unintelligible, his eyes darting toward the... Dr. Holmes seated himself opposite with the air of one who commands the field. "I see you have enjoyed recent prosperity," he observed, indicating the silver coins Pike was nervously fingering. "A generous kinsman, no doubt, or perhaps the price of silence." "Do not trouble to answer. I already know." The lad's colour changed violently. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "Then allow me to remind you," Holmes said softly, leaning forward until his grey eyes held the other in thrall. A coffin lid lifted, a pall adjusted, a cigarette dropped with exquisite timing. "Ah, yes, I see you recall it now. You placed a card upon the coffin, Mr. Pike, and later you handed a note to Neville Fisk." It was observed. "The noose is already tightening. What remains to decide is whether you hang alone or take your accomplices with you." The boy's mouth worked soundlessly. At last he muttered, "I only did as I was told." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "Obedience is a virtue, but discretion more so. Now you will tell me who dictated that card, who forged the letter to Mrs. Kavanagh, and where Ambrose Kavanagh is at this very moment. In return, I may be persuaded to place your name at the bottom, rather than the top, of the bill of indictment." Pike wiped his brow with a shaking hand. "It wasn't me writ it. Mr. Fisk gave me the words, said to copy 'em out on florist card. He said it'd shake the lady, make her believe. Archer knew naught of it, save he told me to do what the gent said, for there was profit in it." "And the letter?" Holmes asked, his voice like ice. The boy hesitated. "That? I swear I never touched it. Fisk showed it me, said it was Ambrose's own hand, said he had ways of getting such things. He laughed when I asked how Holmes's fingers tapped a silent rhythm upon the table. And Ambrose himself? Is he alive?" "I never seen him," Pike whispered. "I swear I never did. But they said, Fisk and the lady—" He broke off, his eyes widening in sudden fear. "I've said too much." "The lady?" Holmes pounced. "Which lady?" But Pike had clamped his lips tight, shaking his head violently. No further persuasion would move him. At last Holmes rose, signalling me to follow. "Enough." "He has given us more than he thinks." Once outside, Holmes strode swiftly, his face grim. "Watson, we have confirmation that Fisk is at the centre of this web. He dictated the card, he produced the letter, and he pays Pike to play his part. But note this. The boy speaks of the lady. He does not mean Mrs. Kavanagh. Her grief is genuine. That leaves but one, Mrs. Harbury. She ordered the flowers, she guided the maid, she lingered at the coffin. Yes, Watson, we have found our second conspirator. I was aghast." "But what can be their object, Holmes? If Ambrose lives, why torment his wife with these grotesque contrivances?" "Because, my dear fellow, she holds the key. Her signature, her assent, these are needed to release the policy or to shift control of the estate. To weaken her mind, to unbalance her belief, is to make her malleable. And if she may be convinced that her husband smiles from the grave, she may also be convinced to part with documents she would otherwise protect. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes pored over his notes with relentless concentration. "Tonight," he said, "we shall have movement. The conspirators will not rest after Pike's loose tongue. We must place ourselves where we can see their play." It was near 10 o'clock when a messenger arrived, one of Wiggins's lads, with word that Neville Fisk had entered Grosvenor Place under cover of darkness. Holmes sprang up, seizing his Inverness and signalling me to follow. "The hour has struck, Watson. Come, we shall see whether Ambrose Kavanagh lives or whether his ghost alone smiles." We reached the house silently, keeping to the shadows. From an alley opposite, we observed the glow of lamps in the withdrawing room. Holmes produced a small field glass and trained it upon the window. Through the thin curtains, the figures within were silhouetted, the unmistakable shape of Neville Fisk, tall and angular, and beside him the stately form of Mrs. Harbury. Between them, at a table, sat Mrs. Kavanagh, her head bowed, a pen in her trembling hand. "By heaven, Holmes, they are forcing her to sign," I whispered. "Precisely," he murmured. "Observe the theatre again. 2 players pressing the victim while the husband is absent. What better way to seize control? But see, she resists." Indeed, Mrs. Kavanagh had pushed back the papers, shaking her head vehemently. Fisk leaned closer, gesturing with an impatience that betrayed his control, fraying. Mrs. Harbury laid a soothing hand upon the widow's arm, pressing the pen once more toward her. At that instant Holmes was gone from my side, crossing the street in 3 noiseless strides. He was at the door before I had gathered my wits, rapping sharply with his stick. The scene inside, when we entered, was one of frozen surprise. Fisk sprang to his feet, his face blanching. Mrs. Harbury rose with more composure, though her eyes glittered dangerously. Mrs. Kavanagh, wide-eyed, clutched the unsigned papers to her breast. "Good evening," Holmes said smoothly, as though paying a social call. "You will forgive the intrusion, but I could not resist joining such a charming family conference." "May I?" He plucked the papers from the widow's hands and glanced at them. "Ah, an assignment of rights under the policy, witnessed by Mrs. Harbury and made in favour of Neville Fisk. How edifying," Fisk blustered. "You have no authority." "Authority?" Holmes cut in, his voice suddenly sharp. "My authority is the truth, sir. You contrived a funeral for a man who yet lives, you placed a mocking card upon his coffin, you forged a letter to his widow, and now you seek to trick her into surrendering what is hers by law. Shall I call this fraud, or shall I call it attempted theft?" For the first time, Mrs. Harbury's mask slipped. "You know nothing," she hissed. "Ambrose is dead. He is—" Holmes's eyes bored into her. "Then where is the body?" "Answer me that, madam." We opened the coffin. It was empty. The effect was electric. Fisk staggered back as though struck, his hand flying to his mouth. Mrs. Harbury uttered a low cry and caught at the table for support. Mrs. Kavanagh gasped, rising to her feet, her face pale as the veil she wore. Holmes turned to her gently. "Madam, you have been the victim of a cruel plot. Trust no signature, no word, until I bring you your husband or the truth of his fate. I beg you, retire upstairs and leave us to deal with these players." She obeyed without a word, vanishing like a shadow. Holmes faced the pair of conspirators, his figure tall and forbidding in the lamplight. "Now, Mr. Fisk, Mrs. Harbury, you have but 2 choices. Speak the truth, or face exposure in a court of law. Which is it to be?" Their silence was more eloquent than denial. Holmes's lips curved in a grim smile. "So be it. The play goes on, but not upon your stage alone." And with that, he gathered the incriminating papers, signalled me to the door, and left them staring after us in impotent fury. In the cab that bore us home through the fog, Holmes's eyes shone with fierce anticipation. "Watson, tomorrow we strike at the heart. Ambrose Kavanagh lives, or his memory is being used by devils in human guise. Either way, the snare tightens. Before this week is out, the smiling man will show his face again, this time not at a funeral, but at the bar of justice. Morning brought Lestrade to Baker Street with his brisk official tread, a smudge of fog on his whiskers, and incredulity in his eye. Holmes received him with a courtesy that did not conceal his impatience, laid before him the papers we had taken from Grosvenor Place, and, last of all, the single fact which changed incredulity to alarm, the empty coffin in the vault of St. Jude's. Lestrade swore under his breath, then demanded warrants, men, and time. Holmes gave him none of these in the form he asked, but something better, direction. "You shall have your men, but not yet," said he. "We strike like a knife, Mr. Lestrade, or we do not strike at all. Your presence in uniform would send our birds clattering from the hedgerow. Allow me to flush them," he had already begun. While the inspector digested the notion of a funeral without a corpse, Holmes wrote a brief note in a crabbed, ill-schooled hand and sealed it with a wafer. "A line from our young friend Pike to his betters," he explained, smiling without mirth. "They've looked into the vault. Best move the gentleman afore dusk. Same place as noon, behind St. Jude's. Cooper's. R.P., the misspelt afore, and the stroke in. The R are his. Wiggins will put it in Fisk's hand within the hour, and a twin in Archer's. Men who feed by night cannot resist the rustle of the game being driven. By the time the fog had thinned to a soiled muslin and the bells marked 4, we had taken our station in the mews behind the church, where the Cooper Dawn kept his dim kingdom of staves and hoops. Lestrade, in a shabby overcoat that sat uncomfortably upon his respectable person, lurked at the far end with 2 plainclothesmen whose boots creaked louder than Prudence. Holmes and I had the shadow of a stable arch from which the gate of the cooperage could be clearly seen. "Remember the boy's tale, Watson?" Holmes murmured. At noon the smiling man came bareheaded and slipped into Dawn's. He left the stink of varnish, as our witness put it, and the laugh still in the air. Varnish does not hang about a gentleman's sleeve unless he has been a guest, where it is boiled. He touched my arm lightly. "Hush." A handcart appeared at the corner, its iron tires grating on the stones. The man between the shafts was Archer, the undertaker, muffled to the chin. On the cart lay a cask, no great thing, but stout and neatly hooped. He backed it through the cooper's door with the practised push of one who has moved such burdens all his life. 5 minutes later, Neville Fisk came swiftly on foot, his hat pulled low, his coat collar up. He looked once over his shoulder, then vanished within. At his heels, swathed in black and veiled, glided a lady who might have been any mourner in London but for the stately carriage we knew too well, Mrs. Harbury. Lestrade stirred, but Holmes's hand was iron on his sleeve. "Another moment," he breathed. "Let us have the author as well as the actors." Silence fell again, broken only by the dull thud of a mallet somewhere within, and a hiss like steam as something hot met damp wood. Then, so faint I thought I had imagined it, there came from the darkness of the Coopers a minute, irregular tapping. Holmes's head lifted. Tap. Pause, tap, tap, tap. He had his notebook out in a flash, jotting the sequence with that astonishing rapidity of his. "Not the monotony of work," he whispered, a signal from within. Either a tool slipped between staves or fingers. He did not wait for a second message. "Now, Lestrade," he said, and the 4 of us moved as one upon the door. What followed was brief and confused. Dawn, the honest Cooper, had barely time to look astonished before Lestrade had pushed past him. Archer sprang from behind a bench, snatching at a hammer. A man of habits, not violence, he was disarmed with contemptuous ease by the inspector's men. Mrs. Harbury made for an inner passage. Holmes reached it first and barred it with his long arm, his bowing civility colder than iron. Fisk, pale but dangerous, had his hand in his breast. Whatever lay there, knife or only bluster, he thought better of it when he saw Lestrade. The cask on Archer's cart lay open at one head, a smear of pitch running blackly down its cheek where a bung had been drawn. From its dark belly came the faint, carrion-like reek of old varnish and spirits, and from somewhere beyond it the tapping again, impatient now. "Open that," said Holmes. Archer fumbled. "It'll spoil the hoop, sir." "Open it," Lestrade snapped, and the cooper, with a glance of mingled pity and curiosity for his trade, so abused, set to with the adze. The head came away. We bent, all four, to look within. It was not a man we saw, but a man's ghostly outline, a suit of dark clothes stuffed loosely with straw, a collar and tie upon a board, a pair of gloves glossy with grease, a small pot of pomade, a bottle of spirit gum, 2 bits of false eyebrow and a strip of flesh-tinted wax that might serve for a moustache or a scar, a florist's coil of wire, and, in a little envelope, 6 of the coarse blank cards we had already learned to detest. Laid atop these grotesque properties like a signature lay a carpenter's pencil sharpened to that telltale chisel, and beneath them all a scrapbook of traced letters, page upon page of Ambrose Kavanagh's hand, notes to his wife, orders to clerks, laboriously copied until the counterfeit lived. Holmes's face, in that instant, was terrible. He lifted the scrapbook with a tenderness he reserves for instruments, then gently replaced it. "Your theatre, Mr. Fisk," he said softly. "Your stage, Mrs. Harbury? Your prompter's box, Mr. Archer? All the properties of your little drama, save the actor for whom you have written. Where is he?" No one answered. Lestrade hauled Archer to his feet and shook him with official impatience. "Come now, a life may hinge on your word." "It weren't me," the undertaker gasped. "I only let the room behind, and that after Mr. Fisk said there was no harm. They paid me." The cask, 'twas their fancy, Holmes had crossed to the inner door and thrown it wide. Beyond lay a mean passage and a small, airless storeroom whose floor bore the marks of something heavy, dragged of late. A chair stood there, scuffed and ugly, with a newly frayed cord about one leg and a rag upon the seat, which, when Holmes lifted it, exhaled the sweet, sickly taint of chloroform. "Not dead, then," he said quietly. "Drugged and handled. And moved, today, after my message." He turned like a falcon on Fisk. "Where?" Fisk found his voice. "You have no right." "Right?" Holmes's laugh was a knife. "The right of a man who has looked into a coffin and found it empty while a widow is bullied at her own hearth. Where?" It was not Fisk who broke, but Mrs. Harbury. Her composure shivered and fell from her like ice from a thawing eve. "It is too late," she whispered, her eyes fixed on some private calculation that had at last failed her. "He has gone to the river." Jabez said it. "Must be tonight, before the company sends their doctor. The barge. Oh, God forgive us, Jabez arranged the barge." Holmes did not look at me, but I felt rather than saw the flash of triumph. "So," he said very softly, "the benevolent partner strikes the harder bargain. Mr. Lestrade, we will have Archer and this lady. Mr. Fisk may do as he pleases for the next 10 minutes, for he will be more useful leading us than following us." The river then, and Jabez Harbury's barge, Lestrade made his dispositions with a speed that did him credit. Archer, protesting, was marched away. Mrs. Harbury, white as her kerchief, yielded without struggle. Holmes paused only to pluck from the cask one of the blank florist's cards, which he slipped into his pocket as if it were a warrant. On the step he caught my sleeve. "You perceive, Watson?" The tap, tap, tap was not from the cask. It was from the little storeroom where our man had been. A last message upon the wall with the heel of a tool, perhaps, or the toe of a boot, now scuffed. He was here at 4 and gone at 5. "We must move like light. The river is wide," I said. "But villains are lazy," he returned. "They choose the nearest stairs. Harbury's counting-house lies by Fenchurch. His warehouse opens upon the pool. We shall try Wapping Stairs first, then Execution Dock, then Hermitage. If we are wrong, we will be wrong quickly." We plunged into the evening together, the fog gathering once more in the hollows and the lamps belting the river with smeared stars. Somewhere between the heave of tide and the slide of pitch upon old planks, a man who had smiled at his own funeral waited for us, or was being borne past hope into the black drift of the Thames. Holmes's stride lengthened, his face, turned to the east, had the pitiless beauty of a drawn blade. We drove hard for Wapping, the cab plunging like a ship through banks of fog that curled about the wheels and broke in wisps over the horse's flanks. Holmes had the trap window down and his face to the east, reading the river by its breath. At Wapping Stairs the tide muttered against the steps and a couple of watermen hunched in their boats with their collars to their ears. No barge lay there save a weed-skirted lighter and a coal hulk which the fog had made monstrous. Holmes had a word with the nearest waterman and was back in an instant, his lip a line. Nothing passed within the half-hour. Execution dock. We ran the short distance along the riverfront, our breath smoking, Lestrade pounding at our heels, the lamps thinning into smeared stars over the black sheet of water. At the old gallows stairs there was motion upon the stream, a dull shape shouldering out of the mist with the clumsy confidence of one who knows the channels. A lighter, low in the water, with a single stern lantern. Behind it, as a mother tugging some deformed child, a squat barge on a tow rope. The stern board of the barge showed. When the lantern swung, a lettered name. Holmes caught my arm. "Harbury and Company, Levant Line," he breathed. "There is our conscience in paint." Lestrade cupped his hands. "Hoy! River police!" A dark boat shot from the murk. Two men, bending to their oars in that smooth, mechanical fashion which spells long practice. A constable in a sou'wester lifted his bull's-eye and took his bearings off the lantern's swing. Lestrade gave the word in terse sentences. The boat altered course and slid like a fish for the shadow of the barge. Holmes had already chosen our place. "The dock ladder, Watson." When the hawser scrapes the stone, we move. The slower water at the steps drew the tow line in so that it kissed the slime-black wall with a groan. We went down together, Holmes first, as ever, our hands ice upon the iron stanchions. The barge loomed, a blind beast, its wet sides sweating river. Holmes's fingers found the gunwale, and in a heartbeat he was over. I followed, the boards underfoot treacherous with frost. A man turned with an oath, broad back, muffler high. Before he could shout, Holmes's stick had described a neat arc, and the fellow went down among the coiled rope like a sack of meal. "Lightermen don't wear patent boots," Holmes observed, casting his lantern. "Hired muscle." "Where is the cargo?" The deck was near to bare save for a tarpaulin-shrouded bulk amidships, and forward 2 hogsheads braced with chocks. From beneath the tarpaulin there came the faintest stir, or it may have been the tide licking the planks. Holmes's lantern ran over the seams. "Help me," he said very quietly. We had the covering off between us. What lay beneath was a thing to turn the stomach with rage. A long crate, no more than a carpenter's box, had been lashed fast. The heads at either end were newly screwed. Between the slats a breath moved, shallow and quick. Holmes's knife flashed and bit. My fingers found the screws and worried them free. The end came loose with a small cry of fibres. Ambrose Kavanagh lay within, trussed hand and foot, a rag tied cruelly across his mouth, his hair dank with the sweat of stupor. His face glistened where some greasy application had been smeared. At the corners of the lips, the waxy stiffness of an undertaker's trick still clung, a parody of that dreadful smile. His eyes, when they met ours, had the incredulous terror of a man awakened from nightmare to another. "Easy, sir," I murmured, and had the gag free. He sucked air with a sobbing sound. Holmes's hands were astonishingly gentle as he cut the cords, massaging the wrists to bring blood back. "No more chloroform, Watson," he said, sniffing the rag I had drawn from the man's mouth. "Its ghost is already here." A scrambling on the deck behind warned us. The second man from the lighter had gained the rail and now came at us with a boat hook. Lestrade's bull's-eye shot a spear of light across the planks. There was the thud of a boot and the crack of wood as the hook struck the crate. The fellow pitched past me into the scuppers and lay still, the hook clanging away into the blackness. From the stern came the voice of the river constable, very calm, naming us and the charge, a grapnel bit, and the barge settled into custody like a dog under a firm hand. Holmes bent close to Kavanagh. "You are safe for the moment. Can you speak?" The man's lips moved. The first sound was a dry rattle. Then, "Harbury," he whispered. His eyes rolled back, and I feared he would faint, but he forced them open again with the courage of a man who has been bullied too long. "Warehouse!" he got out, breath snagging. "Copper! Missing! Smyrna! Would have ruined him! He said, 'Die tidy, no trouble, smile for the lady, God help me!'" Holmes's mouth became a line. "Not now," he said, and signalled to the constable, who swung the lantern to us. Between the four of us we lifted Kavanagh from the box and got him onto a folded sail, covering him. He shuddered once, like a horse brought in from the frost, and then lay very still, the breath steadier. "Where is the tug bound?" Holmes demanded. "Up past Hermitage," the constable returned. "Slack tide, then the bend." "Easy work to drop summit over without a soul seeing." "Aye, clever. Box fills and goes down, and the river carries the rest." Holmes met my eye. The empty coffin was rehearsal. "The river, finale," he straightened, and in the act of doing so turned the lantern on the nearer hogshead. The chalk upon its head had smeared into a blur, but the mark beneath showed clear enough to him. He smiled grimly. "Bay rum, our undertaker's taste travels." Lestrade clambered aboard, blowing like a grampus, triumph and indignation dividing his homely face. "We have the tug," he cried. "Crew secured. And a gentleman by the name of Toller, a clerk from Harbury's, who swears he is sent to see the cargo overboard at a signal. Says Mr. Harbury himself waits at the Hermitage stairs to learn if the business is done." "Then Mr. Harbury shall learn," Holmes answered, "but not what he expects." He turned to me with that sudden, boyish eagerness which in him follows close upon successful hazard. "Watson, you will remain with Mr. Kavanagh. Keep him warm, a nip from the constable's flask, no more. Lestrade, take the tug and barge in tow and set me ashore at Hermitage. If Harbury is the man I take him for, he will not run. Men who calculate so narrowly believe the sum cannot change between line and line." In 10 minutes the clay steps of the Hermitage loomed beside us. Holmes was over the side and up them like a cat, the constable after him. I stayed with my patient, who, under the double assault of air and brandy, had begun to collect himself. In the small circle of the lantern he looked more like a man than a spectre, though the cruel wax at the corners of his mouth gave him, even now, that ghastly hint of mirth. He caught my sleeve. "My wife?" he asked, very low. "She is safe," I said, "and brave. You will see her before the hour is out." From above came the sound of voices on the edge of the fog, flat and sharp. A man spoke with the confidence of one who commands, another answered with the bare civility of duty. Then Holmes's tones, chilly as the river, cut through and ended it. There was a scuffle of boots, a cry, the clack of handcuffs. Presently Holmes's tall outline stood at the rail again, and behind him a heavier, resisting shape which the constable's hand impelled. "Jabez Harbury," said Holmes, much as he might have named a beetle, pinned at last under a label. He came to count a corpse that never reached him. "Lestrade, your case is made. Fraud in the making, abduction, and attempted murder by drowning. The rest we shall supply in detail." He knelt by Kavanagh then, and for a moment all his scorn and rigour fell away. "Sir, you have been made the centrepiece of an ugly arithmetic. The missing copper from Smyrna would have sunk a counting-house. An empty coffin would draw an insurance doctor like a moth to light. Better, thought our excellent Jabez, to hide you a while, make a show for the widow, seize the papers, and at last consign you to the Thames with pitch for ballast. You see how neatly the sums add. Fortunately for you, Mr. Kavanagh, a pencil blunted on a trestle and a boy's tale of varnish offended my sense of the theatre." He looked up, the old flame in his eye. "And now, Watson, to Grosvenor Place. There is a woman who has been asked to look upon a smile and call it truth. We will show her that grief need not be a mask. We made for Grosvenor Place with such haste as the law and the river allowed, Lestrade taking his prisoner and the seized barge in tow, while Holmes secured a closed cab for us and our rescued charge. Kavanagh, swathed in a boat cloak and my own rug over it, bore the jolting with the mute endurance of a man who has looked long upon darkness. Only when the wheels rang upon the familiar stones before his own door did his breath quicken and his fingers close convulsively upon my sleeve. Holmes halted him a moment in the shadowed porch, and with a moistened cloth wiped from the man's mouth and cheeks the last hateful trace of wax and grease. "There," he said, very low. No more smiling on command. Mrs. Kavanagh came to us in the hall without a cry. For an instant she stood motionless, her hands lifted, as if to ward off one vision too many. Then she found him with a movement so quiet and sure that I marvelled how grief can teach its own economy. There was no theatre between them, only a clasp, a breath broken into a half-laugh, half-sob, and his head bent to her shoulder like a child's. Holmes, who distrusts demonstrations, turned away and busied himself with bolts and blinds. When at last they were seated in the withdrawing-room, the lamp shaded, the door secured, Holmes took a chair opposite and spoke with that grave tenderness which, on rare occasions, softened the steel in him. "Madam, you will hear what must be told, and then we shall trouble you no more tonight. Your husband has been the victim of a conspiracy in which money and cowardice have taken hands. Mr. Lestrade has one of its authors in custody before the hour strikes 10. 2 others will be with us before midnight, if they value their liberty more than their pride." Kavanagh's voice, when it came, was roughened by the gag and the river air. "Harbury," he said. "I see his face each time I close my eyes." He came to the warehouse on Tuesday at dusk, all solicitude. "You look worn, Ambrose. Go home to your soup. I'll check the tally." Then Tola brought me a voucher to sign and a glass, God save us, from the office. It stank of varnish. I drank a mouthful out of politeness. It went to the head like a hammer. The rest is snatches, men's hands, the little room behind the coopers, a woman's voice saying, "Steady the corner, the cord slips," and some fool laughing while he stuck fake whiskers to his lip. Afterwards there was pitch and dark and the movement of water. "The woman's voice, could you name it?" Holmes asked. Kavanagh shut his eyes. "Harbury's wife. I would have sworn to it in any court this morning. I would swear doubly now. She used to call at the house, and I never liked the sound of her pity." There was triumph under it. Mrs. Kavanagh shivered, but her chin lifted. "She told me I imagined things when I said the man at the gate had no scar." Holmes gave the ghost of a nod. "He had wax where the scar should be. We found the strip among the properties in Dawn's cask. Your kinsman Neville supplied the height and the gate. Mrs. Harbury, the wire and cards, Archer's lad, the pawl, and Jabez Harbury the arithmetic. Policy here, missing copper there, a widow's signature to bridge the gulf. They are all accountants in their fashion. What they did not reckon was the human sum, a boy's tale of varnish, a trestle's smear of pencil, a woman who saw her husband's mouth taught to smile and mistrusted it." He rose, paced once to the hearth and back, and halted as the bell sounded softly from the area. He glanced at the clock. Punctual. "Wiggins has delivered my notes. Dr. Watson, if you please, take Mr. Kavanagh to the small parlour and keep him there with the door upon the latch. He must be seen at the precise instant, and no sooner. Madam, this will be hard for you a little longer. Courage once more." I guided my patient to the inner room, where he sank upon a settee, spent but resolute. "If I falter," he whispered, "touch my shoulder. I will look for Isabel's eyes and not at the rest." I pressed his hand and left him with the door ajar, whence he could hear voices without being heard. Holmes admitted our first visitor himself. Mrs. Harbury entered with her veil lowered and her composure gathered about her like a cloak. She made no curtsy, her head moved a fraction, very stately, as if to acknowledge a social call. "I am here, Mr. Holmes, at your summons." "You promised information concerning my friend's interests. In good time," said Holmes. "You will oblige me by removing your veil." The truth breathes ill through gauze. She complied with an air that made obedience an insult, and took the chair he indicated, erect, colourless, and silent. The bell sounded again. Neville Fisk came in 2 minutes later, his hat in his hand, his eyes darting from face to face with the restless calculation of a card player. "You wrote that the assignment might yet be secured," he began. "If that is true—" He stopped abruptly as Holmes's gaze, implacable, held him. "The assignment is a phantom, Mr. Fisk," said Holmes, "but the law is not. Sit down." They obeyed him by the same impulse that makes men duck under a whip they cannot see. He took his stand upon the hearthrug, hands behind him, and in a few clear sentences set out the skeleton of the matter, the empty coffin, the properties in the cooper's cask, the chloroform rag, the barge and its crate, and Jabez Harbury arrested at Hermitage, awaiting the morning light and a magistrate. No orator could have found fewer words or a colder music. Mrs. Harbury's lips thinned. "Lies," she said quietly. "Show me this cask of marvels. Show me your river." Holmes's reply was to lay upon the table, one by one, the florist's coil of wire, the coarse blank card, the carpenter's pencil blunted to a chisel, and at last the scrapbook of traced hands. Fisk could not repress a start at the sight of the book. His fingers rose a little from his knee and sank again. "You recognize your schoolroom, Mr. Fisk," said Holmes with a bleak courtesy. "You copied Ambrose Kavanagh's hand until your lines sang. It is good work for a ledger clerk, but you will allow me to prefer the original." He touched the inner door lightly with one finger. The latch gave. Ambrose Kavanagh stepped out, very pale, the marks of the cords livid on his wrists, but his head high. Mrs. Harbury made one involuntary movement backward. Fisk gave a hoarse sound that might have been a prayer or a curse. For an instant no one spoke. Holmes's voice, when it came, was almost gentle. "You desired the widow to see a smile at noon. I desire the conspirators to see a man at 10. Fisk's self-command broke first. "Ambrose, for God's sake, listen, this is some trick. Harbury waits with irons on him," Holmes said. "If you have a song, sing it quickly. The law is a poor audience when it is forced. Or you may spare your breath and keep it for the magistrate." It was Mrs. Harbury who chose speech. She rose, and the dignity in her carriage, which had been her armour, became suddenly pitiful. "We meant no murder," she said, very low. "Jabez swore it. We meant to frighten her, to take the paper, to hide him till the doctor had done, and then—" Her mouth twisted. Whether with scorn for her husband's cowardice or with belated shame, I cannot say. It went as such things go. Too far, Holmes inclined his head once. "Truth saves time. Mr. Fisk?" Fisk's eyes had the wildness of a rat driven to the wall, but there was no hole in that room. He sank back and covered his face with his hands, and from between his fingers there came a muffled sentence. "I wrote the card, I put the wax, I signed the letter. It was her plan and Harbury's purse." "I am a fool, you are all three," said Holmes. "Fool, thief, and coward. Mr. Lestrade will place you where each name may be studied at leisure." There was the scrape of a boot in the passage and the click of a key. The inspector, punctual as a bell. Holmes did not look round. His gaze had gone to the far corner of the room where Mrs. Kavanagh stood, one hand upon the chair back, the other at her throat, looking not at the guilty nor even at her husband, but at Holmes, as if to bind herself to the reality he had given back to her. He bowed, not his quick acknowledgment, but the grave inclination he keeps for the rarest tributes. "Madam," he said, "the theatre is closed." Tomorrow I will lay before you the order of every scene and the use of each property, that you may see how small a thing men's cunning is beside a woman's doubt. For tonight let the curtain fall. Lestrade entered then with his men, and the handcuffs made their small official clack. Holmes moved aside, and I, who have seen many endings, knew by the very economy of this one that my friend had reached his. Yet even as the door closed on our visitors, he turned again to the hearth and the scattered proofs, his eye alight with that last cold pleasure of the intellect, the setting in order. I knew the hour to come, the unravelled skein to be wound again before our eyes, until the whole lay smooth and simple as a strand of wire. Holmes kept his word. By noon of the following day we were once more at Grosvenor Place, the official litter of Lestrade's work having passed like a gale in the night, leaving the rooms in that odd stillness which succeeds a storm. Mrs. Kavanagh received us with a composure at once more human and more assured than any I had yet seen in her. Ambrose, bandaged where the cords had bitten, looked older by a decade, but already steadier. Holmes took no seat. He remained upon the hearthrug, as if the habit of movement still urged him, and set the case before us as he might have placed stones upon a board, each to show its side. "The play opened," said he, with arithmetic. "Months ago a shipment from Smyrna miscarried. Mr. Harbury, who was more gambler than merchant, found his house in peril. He had, however, pressed his partner to insure his life, for a handsome sum. A true misfortune offered him 2 exits, bankruptcy or crime. He chose the latter, with a coward's refinement, for he promised himself that the thing should wear, as he put it to his wife, a decent face. To that end he gathered properties and players. He had in Archer a tradesman of pliable conscience, and in the Ladpike a pair of willing hands. For the part of the smiling man he cast Mr. Neville Fisk, whose resemblance to you, sir, would pass in a crowd when assisted by the artifices of wax, gum, and distance. He took from his pocket a florist's blank, the carpenter's pencil stumped to a chisel, and the looped wire. Observe the chorus behind the principals: florist's cards for false messages, wire for the discreet affixing of tokens, beeswax to hold where pins might show, mastic to smooth where nature rebelled. It is a stage property room entire. Your wife saw the smile upon the coffin and mistrusted it. She was right, for it was painted twice, first upon your poor features by Archer's beeswax and gum, and next upon the crowd by Fisk's trick with the card. He needed a coarse stock and a blunt stroke, where better than a trestle for a desk and a church gate for a screen. That he rehearsed there you may read in the smear of graphite torn by wood grain on the rail. That the bouquet by which he waited was his, we learned from the pollen of chrysanthemum upon Archer's bench, and the entry "paid at door" by Mr. Fisk in Rothwell's book. He turned slightly, and I saw Mrs. Kavanagh's hands relax upon each other by a degree. "The letter," she said, very low. "The letter is the penman's vanity," Holmes answered. "Forgery courts discovery as surely as murder courts the noose. Our gentleman could counterfeit hand by laborious tracing. See here, page upon page of your husband's notes, copied until his fingers knew the spiders of another man's foot. It is good clerk work, but a poor artist's. The folds of yesterday's sheet still smelt of fresh ink when I held them to the lamp, and the phrasing bore a strain. No man signs to his wife as he signs to his cashier. The book in the cooper's cask was the schoolroom, the letter its prize. Pike had seen it, but not made it. Wiser rogues keep their apprentices in ignorance. Ambrose raised his head. "And me? How came I into that black box?" Holmes's eyes hardened. "By 3 cowardices. First, the drug in the office glass, varnish and spirits, as your nose told you, and our river found in the hogshead. Next, the rag suite with chloroform in Dawn's back room. Last, the cords and the crate. On the afternoon of your funeral, after the rehearsal of the noon smile had succeeded, and the widow's wits were challenged, my message in Pike's hand warned them that the vault would not keep a secret. They moved you at once toward the river, the nearest stairs, the easiest reach, the docile tide. So nicely was the time, calculated that Mr. Harbury himself came to count you overboard. It is the small economies which betray such men. He paid in copper and charged in lives. Kavanagh's fingers closed and opened upon the arm of his chair. "I drank," he murmured, with a shame that wrung me. "Like a fool I drank." "You were civil?" Holmes returned, more gently than his words. "There are crimes that grow in the cracks of courtesy. The varnish betrayed them to a stable boy, your wife's refusal, to be taught how to see, finished the thing. Had she accepted the spectacle they made, the assignment would have been signed last night, and you would be in the river this morning. She did not accept it. Therefore we stand here." Mrs. Kavanagh covered her eyes a moment. When she dropped her hand, her lip trembled, but she met Holmes's gaze with something like a smile. "I am glad," she said, "that it was my unbelief that saved him." "It was your obedience to your own senses," Holmes corrected. "Men of accounts live by other men's acquiescence. They expect the world to initial their figures. You declined." He moved at last to a chair, and sank into it with that air of sharp fatigue which comes upon him only when the last knot is cut. "The remainder is for Mr. Lestrade. Harbury will answer to abduction, conspiracy to defraud, and attempted murder. The clerk Toller will confirm the chain from counting house to river. Archer will invoke custom and be disabused of it by a magistrate. Mrs. Harbury's courage last night may count in her favour, for she spoke before the law compelled her, though she must account for the card she bade the maid procure and the hand she laid upon the pawl. Mr. Fiske will find that the letter he wrote is the least of the signatures that bind him." Ambrose made an effort to rise. His wife restrained him with a touch. "And you, Mr. Holmes," he said. "How shall I repay—" Holmes lifted a languid hand. "By avoiding florists' cards and undertakers who smell of gum," he said, with a flash of the old sardonic humour. Then more gravely, "Pay your boy's term at school and the irregulars' supper, that will square my ledger. For the rest, be so good as to bear a plain truth. You were not the first object of this design, money was. You were as a figure shifted on a balance to make the sums agree. Remember it when pity rises for your partner. Men who use lives in arithmetic are not partners, but parasites." There was a little silence. The clock upon the mantel beat out its discreet confession of time. Through the blind came the muffled note of the city resuming its business, as if, having digested one more wickedness, it could proceed the lighter. Holmes stood. "We take our leave. Lestrade will ask you for statements. Give him the facts and keep the adornments. They will not assist him." He turned to Mrs. Kavanagh, and his tone softened again. "Madam, when you write to your son tonight, you may tell him that his father met danger with such composure as he could, and that London, which values a spectacle, was cheated of one. That is a lesson more worth the learning than any I could teach him." She rose and curtsied in that old, simple fashion which makes gratitude noble. "I shall write," she said, "and I shall say that Mr. Sherlock Holmes came into the fog and brought us out again." In the cab, as we turned from the square, I was about to speak, but Holmes had drawn his coat about him and sunk his chin into the collar, his eyes remote. Only when the horse checked at a crossing did he stir. "You observed," he said without looking at me, "how small were the hinges on which the whole turned. A chisel point on a pencil, a smear of pollen, the difference between a man's hand and the schoolboy copy of it, a woman's refusal to mistake a mask for a face. I sometimes think, Watson, that Providence writes its largest judgments in the smallest script. And the smile?" I asked. "It will fade." "It has faded," said he. "We wiped it away at the door." He settled again, and the ghost of a wearied warmth touched his mouth. "If Lestrade is industrious, he shall have the credit by dinner time. We, my dear fellow, shall have Mrs. Hudson's cutlets and a violin that has not been asked to mimic undertakers." 2 days later, London had already made a paragraph of it and turned the page. The morning papers, hungry for spectacle, were cheated of their drama at the river, but took their revenge in print. Shipbroker's plot attempted, drowning. Extraordinary exposure by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The yard moved with ponderous efficiency once the road was beaten. Harbury, defiant at his first examination, grew less so when Toller, the clerk, put his neat finger upon every figure that would not add, and when the river police produced from the tug's locker the very crate screws I had worried free. Fisk, who had fancied himself a man of resources, collapsed into a litter of admissions as soon as the scrapbook of tracings lay open under the magistrate's lamp. Archer protested custom. Custom did not protest for Archer. Young Pike, terrified by the sea change in his patrons' faces, told the truth in broken phrases and tears. Mrs. Harbury, pale and unadorned, spoke sparingly, but did not lie. Dawn the cooper, honest tradesman, left the court with his good name, and his pity for the abuse of his craft was the only sentiment I heard there that had no self in it. Sentence would follow in due form. It is not my habit to chart the steps by which justice reaches the cell. Suffice it that the law found in Harbury what Holmes had named in him, an accountant of lives, that Fisk went down for forgery and conspiracy, that Archer learned how narrow a thing usage is when set against a man's safety, that Pike's youth and confession availed him a measure of mercy, and that Mrs. Harbury, whose courage had broken, the plot at the end, if not in the beginning, heard words from the bench that were not without compassion, even while they condemned. If there was tragedy anywhere beyond the dock, it was in the figure of Ambrose Kavanagh, who stood in court once, very straight, to identify those who had made of his mouth a smiling mask. For when he sat again, he seemed to me, for all his freedom, older by that curious decade the soul travels in a night. I remember Baker Street the evening of the verdict, rain striking the panes like pins, and Mrs. Hudson's lamp throwing a circle of domestic light that refused the city's chill. Holmes had spent the afternoon in that quiet ordering which follows every hunt. All the small proofs lay upon the table, each with its tail neat as a docket, the florist's loop of wire, the blunted carpenter's pencil, the coarse blank card, a smear of wax sealed between two slips of glass, and a few grains of chrysanthemum pollen caught in the fold of an envelope. He surveyed them as a general might his battered colours, not with sentiment, but with recognition of service. "You see, Watson," said he, as he placed the last item in its packet, "how entirely the matter stood on trifles. A glove's odour, a tressel's scar, a florist's habit of sending cards on wire, the way wax takes the print of a thumb. Our mountebanks trusted distance, fog, and a widow's tears to blur their handiwork. The one thing they forgot was that the world, viewed closely, writes in a fine hand." "We had only to read it, and the letter?" I asked. "I never saw you so moved as when you held it to the lamp." He gave a slight grimace of distaste. "Forgery is the vanity of men who cannot quite believe themselves villains. A thief will take a purse in the dark and sleep. The forger must sit up late to admire the curve of his stolen A. It was good clerkship and detestable art. The ink new at the folds, the phrases with the shop smell still upon them. I confess, Watson, that if there is one instrument I dislike to handle more than a murderer's knife, it is a pen that has written a lie in a husband's hand." We sat quiet a little. The violin lay across the chair arm, silent. From the mantel, the clock made that discreet confession of time that has soothed so many of my friends' more fevered hours. Presently there came a light tap, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a note. Holmes glanced at the hand and smiled in his dry fashion. "Isabel Kavanagh," he said. "Our brave doubter asks if she may send to our address a parcel for Wiggins's lads, for those small soldiers who walk in fog without being lost. Admirable. She adds that her boy has written from school. Dear Mamma, tell Mr. Holmes I do not like chrysanthemums and think the Thames a very wicked river, but I am glad father is not in it." Holmes's hard line softened for an instant. "There, Watson, is an epitaph for a case. I could not better it with all my epigrams." "Your epigrams," said I, have saved more than one neck." "My dear fellow," he returned languidly, "they have saved nothing. It was your patient's wife who refused the lesson her betters set her. Remember that. When next you are tempted to praise me in print, praise the courage that declines to see what all the world insists is before its eyes. We live, unfortunately, in an age much addicted to theatre." He lifted the florist's card between forefinger and thumb, then let it fall back among the proofs. "A stage can be struck, a character is not so quickly altered. Harbury could balance ledgers, he never learned to look a man in the face. That, I think, was the flaw that let the light in." He rose then, with that sudden elastic motion which is half fatigue shaken off and half some new current touching the nerves, and crossed to the bureau. The Persian slipper yielded him a pinch of tobacco. The spirit lamp took the chill from his fingers. He stood a moment in profile, hawk-faced, thoughtful, then broke from his stillness as a fish breaks water. "Mrs. Hudson's cutlets," he said briskly. "And after dinner, perhaps, a little kreutzer, pure air for the brain. Lestrade will be round before 9 to borrow the phrase with which to describe his own triumphs. We must be prepared to admire him." He was right. The inspector arrived at the stroke, full of the good humour of a man who has plucked ripe fruit and means to carry it to market. He bore himself well, he praised where praise was due, he even, rare grace in him, admitted that the cooper's tap and the florist's wire lay beyond his training. Holmes listened, wore his courtesy as easily as his dressing-gown, and saw our visitor off into the wet with a discreet word for his constable's conduct at the river. When the door closed, he leaned his shoulder against it and laughed soundlessly. "You are uncharitable," I protested. "Not in the least," said he. "The yard must have its meat. It keeps the teeth sharp." "Let them carve. I have had my music." He returned to the fire and, for the first time since the river fog lifted off Ambrose Kavanagh's face, took up the violin. The first notes were tentative, then the tone found its centre and filled the room, not with some melancholy improvisation such as he permits himself when the mind is baffled, but with a clear, almost austere line that might have been a Bach allemande, reason singing to itself in a minor key. There is an image from those days which returns to me often. It is of a window made black by rain, of a man in a chair whose profile might have been cut on a coin, of a little congregation of humble objects upon a table, the wire, the card, the stump of pencil, each whispering its fact, of a house settling into tranquillity after danger has blown through it like a March wind, of a city beyond, enormous and indifferent, making its million calculations while a few quiet sums are set right. Holmes lowered the bow at last, and the silence came back with a weight that was not oppressive, but complete. "Tell me, Holmes," I said, "when did you first know that the coffin was empty?" "When Mrs. Kavanagh's glove told me it had touched wax where grief should have found wood," he answered. "After that, each step went where it had to go. Smiles, my dear Watson, are honest only when they need no wire." He closed the case of the violin with a click that was like a period at the end of a proof. "Come, our play is ended. Let us not wait for the curtain call." And so, as so often, we left the solved thing behind us, as a man leaves a room in which he has dined, grateful for the good fare, a little weary of company, and already turning, with the inexplicable appetite of the mind, toward the next door in the corridor of London.